Hi, my name is Katharine Hayhoe, and I am a climate scientist. You might be wondering, why talk about climate change now? I mean, we've just spent the last year, honestly, it feels like about a decade, doesn't it? Or maybe 100 years, just trying to cope with COVID. And it's true, our world right now is just overwhelmed with this virus. But as this cartoon illustrates, behind the wave that's currently swamping us of COVID lurks an even bigger tsunami, and that tsunami is climate change. It hasn't gone away because of our current crisis. And in fact, it's approaching even more quickly now than it was a year, or two, or a decade ago. What do climate change and COVID have in common? On the surface, not much. But once we start to dig a little deeper, it turns out there's quite a bit. And I think there's some important lessons that we can learn from that. Starting with this one. We've known about their risks far in advance. So the history of human civilization is full of examples of pandemics and plagues and viruses affecting people. We see them in movies, we read about them in books, we even might have stories in our own family history, like my two great-grandparents who died in their early 20s in the Spanish flu pandemic, leaving my grandfather an orphan. At the same time, we've known for over 100 years that digging up coal and then later oil and natural gas and burning it is producing heat-trapping gases. These heat-trapping gases are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it does not need. And just like you would if somebody snuck into your room at night and put an extra blanket on you, you'd wake up sweating saying, I didn't need this. In the same way, our planet is running a fever because of our choices. And we've known this, and we've known that the planet is warming as a result for a very long time. The second thing that coronavirus and climate change have in common, though, is that somehow, despite our knowledge, we didn't think that they mattered to us. We saw COVID as something happening over there, not here. And with climate change, it's the same way. As you can see from these maps from the Yale Program on Climate Communication, this is a great resource. You can look at the public opinions on about 30 different questions by county and by congressional district. I'll just show you a couple of them. Anywhere that is orange or yellow is greater than 50% of people say yes. Anywhere that's blue is less than 50% of people say yes. And obviously the darker the color, the more people say yes or no. So 72% of people across the US say that global warming is happening. And 71% agree that it will affect plants and animals. 71% also agree that it will affect future generations. So people and places and animals and plants far away from us. 65% say global warming will affect people in developing countries, over there, not here. 61% say it will affect people in the US. You see how the numbers are going down, right? And then they ask this question, do you think global warming will affect you? Oh my goodness, all of a sudden the country is largely blue. So somehow, despite acknowledging that the risks are real, we engage in some magical thinking where somehow we imagine it won't affect us. And of course it will, it does, and in many cases, it already is. Here's the third thing COVID and climate change have in common, and this might surprise you. They're both public health crises. Now, obviously coronavirus is, but how is climate change a public health crisis? Well, did you know that as climate changes, our heat waves are getting stronger and more intense, and those affect our health? They lead to hospitalizations and even deaths. Did you know that the warmer the air, the faster the chemical reactions happen in the atmosphere that cause ground level ozone, which is a dangerous pollutant? So the warmer it gets, the worse our air pollution and even our allergies get. We see that hurricanes are getting stronger and bigger and more damaging. Wildfire is burning greater area as it gets hotter and drier. So our weather disasters are getting worse. Heavy rainfall is increasing because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along today, there's more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago. And that is increasing the contamination of our water supply. We're also seeing that diseases that are carried by mosquitoes and ticks and insects are spreading northward as it gets warmer because they're not killed off by warm winters. And we're seeing this, of course, happen with plants and with animals too, not just diseases that affect humans. And we're seeing that these impacts are affecting our mental health, they're affecting the quality and the supply of our food, and they're even potentially increasing the risk of conflict and refugee crises. And then there's the fact that burning fossil fuels is the primary source of air pollution, as well as climate change, both. And air pollution also affects our lungs. In fact, air pollution is responsible for almost 9 million deaths every year worldwide. And just to put that in perspective, we've seen 2 million deaths worldwide from COVID so far. 9 million from air pollution, 2 million from COVID. Don't you think you should have seen a headline on that sometime? We see that every year, 200,000 of those in the United States every year. And here's the link. It turns out that if your lungs have already been exposed to a lot of air pollution, and right here in the US, as well as in poor countries around the world, it's the people who can't afford to live in better neighborhoods who are often exposed to most of that air pollution. We are seeing that that makes you more vulnerable to COVID. If your lungs are already weak because of air pollution, then when you're exposed to coronavirus, you're more likely to get it. When you get it, you're more likely to get very sick or even die. So there's a direct connection, not just an indirect one. And that brings me to the fourth important point, which is that both COVID and climate change affect all of us, but they affect certain people more. Who? People who are already poor, who are already marginalized or disadvantaged, women and children around the world, indigenous peoples, people of color. Climate change takes people who are already suffering, who are already disadvantaged, who are already marginalized, who are already vulnerable, and it exacerbates or makes their suffering worse. Let me just give you a couple more concrete examples. First of all, since the 1960s, climate change has already increased the gap, the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world by as much as 25%. As COVID has swept around the world, we see that it's pushing millions more children into poverty, according to the United Nations. The World Bank finds that between 88 to 115 million people will be pushed into poverty, which they define as living on less than $1.90 a day. Wherever we look, climate change, air pollution, and COVID together are harming people, real people here and now. So what's stopping us from acting? Often it's fear. Fear that there aren't good solutions or that nothing we will do can make a difference. Social science has a word for this. It's efficacy. What does that mean? It's the idea that we think that acting can make a difference. Do we have personal efficacy? Do we feel like if I act that I can actually do something? We have a sense of collective efficacy. Could we work together to accomplish something? And the answer with climate change is yes. Individuals and communities absolutely can make a difference. But in order to make that difference, we need to understand that we have the ability to do so. What gives us that is hope. And that's why I'm convinced that the response to the fear that we so often feel when we're confronted with these huge global issues, the response to that fear is hope. Hope won't come and find us if you're just scrolling through the news feed. All you'll get is fear and doom and anger and frustration. But hope exists when we connect with other people, when we understand that we are not alone, that there are many other people helping to work on this problem and solve this problem. And how do we start any of this? We start by talking about it. As my TED Talk says, and this was not my TED Talk, the next step is to watch my TED Talk. As my TED Talk says, the number one most important thing that anybody can do about climate change is talk about it, to use our voices to advocate for change at every level, from our families, our schools, our places of work or worship, our cities, counties, towns, and elected representatives, telling people that yes, the risks matter. Yes, they're here and now, but our choices make all the difference in the world. And by working together, we truly can transform the fabric of our society, and we can tackle this enormous global problem of climate change.